It's not calling you Josh Frydenberg, it's calling you Dosh Frydenberg.
Under the coalition, taxes for hard-working Australians will always be lower.
You know, I don't hold a hose, mate, and I don't sit in control room.
They're answers that only can come from Victoria, I'm afraid, because that's not my job.
But I ain't spending any time, though, because in the meantime, every 3 months, a person is torn to pieces by a crocodile in North Queensland.
Well, g'day and welcome to another episode of Hard Hats and High Vis. We are now, I believe, in week 16. G'day, Hong Kong Jack. How are you today?
Hot and streamy up here.
Is it really? Yeah. Bit of climate change, mate.
I think
severe weather event.
We have a thing here called the heat index, which is the temperature plus the effective humidity, etc., and it hit 47 yesterday, I think. So.
Oh, nice. Yeah, that's uncomfortable. You'll be grateful for the air conditioning. Hope it's working at its optimum for you. Look, as we do with all intros in this program, we just remind our listeners that if you enjoy our little bit of back and forth banter on current events in Australian politics and media and society and sport, then give us a review on your podcast app. Hopefully it'll be 4 or 5 stars, but we're not going to tell you what to do. And if you do have any questions, any issues that we've raised in the program, or indeed stuff that you would like us to raise in the program, drop us a line at the conditionalreleaseprogram@gmail.com, or you can hit me up on Twitter on @JackTheInsider. And my DMs are always open, but it might take me a day or so to get to you. All right, Jack. There was an interview in The Australian with the former Secretary of State of the United States in the Nixon administration, Dr. Kissinger, at 99. He has urged Australia to remain close to the US, but believes that the government should engage in dialogue with China. That's all pretty straightforward, isn't it?
Well, Dr. Kissinger was the person who went across to see the Chinese before Nixon paid that first visit to China. So he's sort of the author of the modern relationship with China.
Yeah, look, in many ways. I mean, if we remember, he was denounced fairly severely and certainly had a fair bit to do. I believe Kissinger and Ford were in Jakarta the day of the Indonesian invasion of East Timor. He was involved with Nixon in the secret war of Cambodia. Shouldn't he be a little bit worried about travelling to Holland, Jack?
Oh,
travelling to the Netherlands?
Yeah, he's 99. He'll be fine.
Well, he's certainly got some blood in his hands. So I do remember Alan Jones, the broadcaster Alan Jones, saying he was one of the great minds of the great geopolitical minds of our times. And you think, mate, look, he did a lot of things that was so suspect, but his message is pretty good, isn't it? You know, I mean, and it is a lead for Australia to follow. I mean, I don't think it's a particularly unique idea, but that we speak with the Chinese, but we retain our very strong alliance with the United States.
Yeah, well, I think that's a pretty conventional approach, yeah.
Yeah, because if we go back just a little while, we weren't engaging in dialogue at all, were we? I mean, well, the dialogue that was being conducted was done by a bullhorn, either from the Home Affairs Minister or Defence Minister, who went on to become Defence Minister, that is the current opposition leader, Peter Dutton, or Scott Morrison.
This wasn't peculiar to Australia, I might add. This dates back to around 2017 when there was a change in the Chinese approach to diplomacy.
Yeah, tell us about that.
In Deng Xiaoping's day, when he was running the show in China, he had an approach which he called biding our time and hiding our strengths. And that survived the end of Deng's time and right up until about 2017 when President Xi Jinping decided it was time to move on from that, and they adopted a more aggressive approach to diplomacy. Some people have called it the wolf warrior approach, which is named after a Chinese movie, I believe. But they certainly did become more aggressive, and they were not just aggressive to the Australians, but they were aggressive in PNG and Sweden and everywhere else, really everywhere around Southeast Asia, and that has led to a more fractious relationship between the Chinese and a number of other countries, most other countries, since then.
Is it a case of an emerging power muscling up now? That's
Oh,
basically it, isn't it?
It's a little bit of that, yes.
Emerging economic and military power.
And just a change of approach that the new president, or the then relatively new president in Xi Jinping, undertook. So that's just these things happen in countries all around the world. People have a slightly different approach as leadership changes.
And it is our largest trading partner, of course, by some measure. So it is a relationship that Australia needs to get right.
Very important relationship.
It doesn't mean cap in hand stuff, but that does mean that you conduct your diplomacy behind closed doors, Jack.
As much as you are able to. That's a little bit difficult when there is an absence of ministerial contact, and I think that. It would be a mistake to say that the absence of that ministerial contact was all on Australia's side.
No, I'm sure it wasn't. But the phone didn't ring. Well, no, the phone rang, but it rang out from Australia for a very long time. So that relationship needs to be improved. The big story around at the moment is foot and mouth disease. And obviously it's been found in Bali and throughout Indonesia as well. It potentially catastrophic economic impact. The report has just been issued and how it would affect Western Queensland, for example. Just Western Queensland, not a huge population there, but there would be 34,000 jobs lost.
There's a lot of cattle. There's a lot of cattle in Western Queensland. Not a lot of people, but
fewer people. But $1.1 billion hit to Central and Western Queensland alone, and the figure of 50 billion has been bandied about. And that report was commissioned by the Regional Development Australia, Central and Western Queensland, showing a devastating impact, the arrival of foot and mouth disease. I do know, Jack, and you would know too possibly, that it has been detected in border crossings, entry into Australia from Indonesia. It certainly hasn't got out into the wider community and out into the farms. But there is some difference between the opposition's approach and the government approach. The government approach is to impose biosecurity measures at the border, basically in airports, while opposition leader Peter Dutton has called for the borders to be closed to keep foot and mouth disease from infecting Australian livestock. Which approach is right, Jack?
Well, I think a little bit of caution's in order with regard to this. I wouldn't be closing the borders, but there's always a bit of politics playing with these things. And sometimes people do act a bit quickly. I can recall, I can't think of his name now, a Queensland chap who was Minister for Ag I think in the Rudd or Gillard governments, who stopped all of the live transport of cattle at one stage pretty precipitously.
That was on the basis of animal cruelty concerns.
Yeah, but he sort of just cut it off immediately, and that caused a whole lot of disruption and had little effect on the animal cruelty situation. So I think you can act too quickly.
I think that you basically need to.
I should know that chap's name. His dad's a power broker in Brisbane.
Yes, he was. He was one from the old. Labor Right faction, wasn't he?
The AWU faction. They had their own faction in Queensland. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Look, I can see the fellow, but I can't remember his name. Not a memorable decision, though. But Peter Dutton.
So I think you can move too quickly, and I don't think the government's approach is probably right about this. Is to have a look at the biosecurity, see where it's going, and then if you have to ramp it up. No one wants to close off the tourism industry with Bali and Indonesia.
Well, that's just it. I've seen a number of agriculture, Department of Agriculture employees, senior fellows, talk about how we do not want to, how any decision can't really be cast across other industries like tourism. The Balinese have been battling with COVID. It would be a real blow to them too. But this is a $50 billion industry. Let me just quote you, Peter Dutton, on radio today. He told 2GB, I believe the borders should be closed, absent the information the government's got. If there's an argument why the border shouldn't be closed, that's for the Prime Minister to make. If he's got a reason, then let him explain it. Gee, that's just dripping in politics, isn't it? It's basically saying, look, we should close the borders, but I don't have the information on which to close the borders. But he just puts it straight on Albanese to the Prime Minister to explain himself.
Well, it's just pretty much classic opposition politics. It's fine as far as I'm concerned, but that's not
alarmist, Jack.
Well, a little bit, but that's opposition politics.
Yeah. Okay. So Agriculture Minister Murray Watt. I've been watching his career emerge over the last 5 or 6 years. Murray Watt told the ABC that Australia still remained free from foot and mouth disease, but that the travelling public would need to do the right thing. If there's one message I can leave, it is that Australia remains foot and mouth disease free. He said, we have absolutely no evidence at all that the virus is in Australia. Now, that's contrary to we might call a port or a border crossing, an airport, where I believe it has been found. He also said that authorities were now risk profiling 100% of passengers returning from Indonesia. Those are the sorts of measures that are required. And a tougher compliance regime has been implemented at all airports. Mr. Watt said that at Melbourne Airport on Saturday, there were around 3,700 passengers coming in from Indonesia who would be checked by authorities. He said, while there is a risk that a traveller could bring this back from Bali, that risk is much lower than meat products being brought into the country. That's also a very serious concern. He also provided an assurance that it was not necessary to shut the border with Indonesia. That measure is not needed, he said. There are foot and mouth disease outbreaks in about 70 countries in the world at the moment. That's a stat that I did not know. He went on to say industry is united in saying we should not close the border. Now, Dan Tehan, his shadow minister, has said the reverse. But Dan Tehan was talking about constituents in Wannon down in Victoria. But this is, there is an extraordinary threat. If there is a foot and mouth disease outbreak in Australia, our exports just stop there and then.
Yeah, one of the things that I think governments have not done well enough in Australia is explaining to travellers arriving in Australia why we have what seem to be bizarre biosecurity requirements to enter the country and biosecurity checks. Australia's been almost uniquely well placed because it's an island continent in remaining free from a lot of these diseases that affect agricultural industries, and that's why we take the rather extraordinary precautions we do take with arrivals from overseas. But we've just never done much about, apart from that rather ridiculous show, Border Force, whatever it's called, Border Patrol. We've never done much to explain why we do that.
A veterinary professor, Professor Merriweather, she was actually largely responsible for the response in the UK in 2001, I think, their FMD outbreak there, absolutely devastating for industry. She actually spent some time in Australia as the veterinary official for New South Wales, and she was saying just that. You have to communicate. That's the government's role. You have to establish with people. We do know, Jack, that not everyone who travels from Australia to Bali would be described as the sharpest tools in the shed, but it is important to let them know that they run the risk of bringing this disease back into the country, particularly by importing or travelling with meat products, or indeed some viruses on the soles of their shoes. Communication is absolutely critical to tell people, listen, be at your best here.
I think that's a fair assessment of the travellers to Bali. I believe there's no written test required to enter.
Written request. They do say that the red eye to Bali is not a good flight to catch, Jack.
No.
Fair bit of a disruption.
I grew up on the New South Wales Victorian border in a fruit growing area. And
Fruit fly?
And we had the fruit fly checks. So to cross the border at Albury Wodonga or at Yarrawonga Mulwala, it was like going through Checkpoint Charlie when I was a kid.
It was, yeah.
You know, you had to had the little puller. You had to pull into the side, and they checked the car.
A local would have the sticker. I remember the locals would have the sticker.
The orange sticker, yes.
Yeah, go straight through.
It meant you'd go straight through, but everybody else, it was like crossing Checkpoint Charlie in Berlin. But everyone understood what that was about. That's because the communication was quite good, that we had these valuable fruit growing areas in Victoria that had no fruit fly, and that would cause a lot of disruption and a lot of losses. So people said, okay, we'll put up with that, but you've got to explain what's going on.
Yeah, indeed. You know, that's the critical thing. You would think it was an absolute last resort to close off Indonesia to Australian travellers coming there and back, and be absolutely devastating for Bali. It would have to be a last resort.
I'd have to sell my Bintang shares, you know.
Yeah, have you got the shirt? Have you got the T-shirt?
Yeah.
I think that's one of those things. You do come back with Bali with a couple of those.
Yeah. Yeah. Or the Chang shirt from Thailand or whatever. Yeah.
Look, I've never had the Bintang, but I did have a Chang shirt for a very long time there. Josh Frydenberg has landed at Sachs on his feet. We need not have mourned his passing. He's found a pretty good job. There was some talk that he was going to head up the AFL, Jack. CEO there. Is that ever serious?
I always thought that was a bit unlikely myself.
But a bit unlikely. Good Carlton man, must be said.
Yes, yeah. He's very much a football fan. He was a pretty fair tennis player. I think he was sort of not too far off turning pro when he was a kid.
Yeah, no, he was. Yeah, there was that in the offing, and he was good enough to be pro, but to turn pro. But politics and one or two other things got in the way. We won't go into who's going to be running the AFL, but they would almost certainly, as they generally do, will be employing from within, I would think.
First they'll pay a consulting firm an arm and a leg to do a worldwide search, and then they'll find the bloke was sitting right behind him.
Yeah. There'll be an expensive search, and but they go, the deputy.
They should
probably get it.
They should ask us to do the worldwide search, because we can say, we're doing it. Yeah, we're doing it.
We'll drop you an email. We'll drop you an email shortly.
Yeah, and thanks for that 10 million, but it's the bloke in the next desk, you know.
I know. Yeah. Look, I've got to say that I have seen Josh at the footy, at the Carlton footy, and he's one of these head in the hands type barrackers, Jack. I don't like it. He doesn't have a positive view of the Blues. Whenever the other mob kick a goal, he's got the head in their hands. He's been kicked around a fair bit, it must be said, for the last 10 or 15 years.
Yeah, I've got a Geelong fan, mate. We used to watch the footy here at the pub in Hong Kong. Whenever it got close in the last quarter, he'd be out the front door with the smokers. He just couldn't stand to watch.
Couldn't bear to watch. I don't know why. I mean, Geelong got pretty good history of winning the close ones. Yeah. Look, we have inflationary issues in Australia. That is the big economic problem that we've got. It's global. We've got inflation at 5.1 for the first quarter of this year, and it's bound to get higher. Anyone who's been into a supermarket of late would understand that. and while prices at the pump have just dropped a touch. You probably don't know what petrol costs in HK. It's bound to be expensive. It's about $1.85 here, I'll say that conservative, but $1.85 a litre. The petrol here, the diesel's a little bit dearer. What can the government do? It doesn't have too many tools at its disposal, does it? You can, I guess, you can restrain spending. There's a fiscal response to be made there, and we can talk about one of the issues they could easily.
That's a little bit hard to do, the restraining spending, when you're a newly elected government who's made some promises. That creates its timing issues. You know?
Well, we don't have it on our little document here, Jack, but we did take a look and had a bit of a chat last week about the childcare repayments or rebates to young parents, and up to 500,000 family income, joint income, and you still get a little bit from the government. At $250,000 a year, you're getting almost a quarter of your childcare costs subsidised. That's crazy, isn't it? I mean, that is Labor policy. They went into the election with this.
Yeah, and they'll do it, and it'll be popular. But I've never understood it myself.
I don't understand. The one thing I do hate about this is that when you do mention these figures, like someone's on 250, or the family, the joint income, is on 250 large a year, then you have these stories coming forward in the media about people on 250 a year saying, gee, it's not that easy. It's a bit of a battle, and I find that stuff immensely amusing, a little bit frustrating too. That if you're on 250 a year, that you're somehow a battler. Doesn't make a lot of sense, does it? For me, I reckon 250 is almost the cut-off point. If you're on 250, you shouldn't receive a cracker from the government. Nothing.
No, I don't. I've never quite seen the point for people who are on those sort of incomes, paying the money to government fiddling around with it for a while and giving you some of it back, and all the rest of it's being spent in Canberra on public service salaries. I never quite understood that.
Yeah, look, it seems to be a pretty poor use of money. What we might do, Jack, is go through the childcare policy in some detail next week and have a look at that.
See if we can make some sense of it.
I guarantee you, what we will provide Labor policy, and it doesn't make sense. It does make sense at that $75,000 family income level, where a great deal, I think, sort of something like 93% of childcare costs are subsidised and rebated, but up at that 250 level and beyond, it doesn't make any sense whatsoever.
I suspect there is one place that makes sense, Jack.
Where's that?
At the ballot box.
Yeah, I don't even think it's a vote winner. I really don't think it's a vote winner. We'll talk about that next week.
My suspicion is we'll move on to it. Now, I see you asking whether the RBA moved quickly enough.
Yeah.
And what I'd say about that is I was reading a couple of articles.
Wisdom in hindsight, obviously, from a lot of analysts.
Yeah, but I was reading a couple of articles over the weekend about what's happening in the EU. And their inflationary pressures are much worse than Australia. They range from well over 9% is kind of the floor, up to 20% in the east of the EU areas.
Much worse in the east, yeah.
And they were ripping into their central bank and saying, all the articles are ripping into their central bank, and they've moved much, much too slowly. They should be looking at what the Americans have done and what the Australians have done, who've got this about right.
Yeah, those measures that discussion hasn't made its way to Australia, because there has been a great deal of criticism of the RBA, to the point now where it is currently being reviewed and assisted by the Treasury. But we do have 40% of Australians who've rolled off record low mortgage rates. and loans with negative equity. Those are the ones where you basically borrow 100% of the cost of the dwelling to buy it, are the most likely to fall into default. But we have no strong rise in defaults on the available data, and I suspect that might go through an increase in perhaps the third and fourth quarters of this year and beyond.
I can remember having a chat with a bank chap back in the early 1990s, and we were talking about real estate prices in inner Melbourne, where we were both resident in those days, Jack.
Yes.
And he said, there's basically no real market in housing in a fair bit of inner Melbourne because between the four big banks, we own a lot of it.
Well,
in residential housing. He says we effectively own a hell of a lot of it, and we're just not moving it because if we all move to default on these loans, there would be a catastrophic drop in prices.
Yeah, the way it works is if you go 90 days into arrears, then that is the time that a bank can pull a pin on you. They don't always, of course, Jack.
No.
And sometimes they go under.
He was giving me the very strong message that we were not doing that because we figured that collectively they figured that the market would recover, interest rates would come down, and the problem would diminish of its own accord or of its own momentum. So they wouldn't
the housing loans were at 17%, vastly unregulated, vastly more closed market than we have now. But interest rates are about, I think, official interest rates got to 17%. At that stage, credit card and all that sort of stuff much higher, but it did come down really quickly. That's the benefit. And all those people who could hang on did hang on.
Yes.
And in terms of equity, 20 years later, happy days.
And he was right. The banks played that pretty well.
Yeah. They have to be sort of socially responsible in many ways too. And the other thing is they don't want to be large-scale landowners.
No, they don't.
Because it comes with all sorts of problems.
Yeah.
Yes, look, we'll keep an eye on all of this. The next, we are probably about 3 weeks away from an announcement on inflation. I would expect it to go up, but I don't think it's going to be anywhere near the US rate, which is just on 9.
The next US figure comes out this week. They've got a whole series of economic figures coming out this week.
Ours can't be far away. Yeah, ours can't be far away either. I mean, obviously, the end of the financial year occurred almost 4 weeks ago now. We're recording on the 25th of July. Jack, COVID, you've had a shocker in Hong Kong with COVID. Australia was wide open and bounteous in the meantime, but we have got very, very high numbers now in terms of infections and in terms of hospitalisations and ICU admissions. And I'm really responding to a John Hewson piece from the Saturday paper where he claimed...
Oh, is that where John Hewson's fetched up?
He has, yeah.
So he's too left wing for the Nine newspapers now. He's gone to the Saturday paper.
Found his niche. I mean, it's the old... He's gone the inverse, hasn't he? I mean, the other way, as you get older, you tend to become more right wing, and some of us sort of barge our way beyond sort of Genghis Khan. He seems to be heading all the way to Vladimir Lenovich, Vladimir Lenin.
He'll be writing for the Green Left Weekly, or is the Tribune, the Communist Party paper, still published in Australia? He'll be writing for them, sir.
He's not down the Southern Highlands anymore, but he used to be. I bump into him. He's quite an agreeable fellow. But his piece, and look, he's not on his own here, Jack. Saying that the state and federal governments are ignoring medical advice by not imposing mask mandates. And we saw Dan Andrews interviewed yesterday, or I did, on SBS news service actually, and he said he's not telling people, he's asking, please put on a mask in an enclosed area, in indoors. And he also said, and he made a very good point, I think, and I wish that one of the journalists had have asked him for a bit more information, but he said mask mandates are incredibly difficult to police.
Yeah, look, we have a sort of a mask mandate here, although to be fair, it was a community mask mandate before it became an official one. That is, you couldn't get on a bus or hop into a taxi without a mask on.
Because the driver wouldn't have you.
The drivers wouldn't have you in either case. But then it became official. I do notice that 2 or 3 days ago, Japan hit 200,000 cases a day.
Wow.
And while they've never had a mask mandate in Japan, they have almost universal mask wearing.
Yeah.
And to be fair, they had mask wearing long before COVID.
These are learned behaviours, aren't they?
Yeah.
Whether it was from bird flu or one of the other,
or the slightest sniffle, a bit of tickle in your throat, you put your mask on before you go to work.
But that's just being responsible, isn't it?
Yeah,
really?
yeah. And they live in a crowded place, and Hong Kong's been much the same. But 200,000 cases a day, all that mask wearing, it doesn't seem to make that much difference.
Yeah, I think Andrews is right. Firstly, you don't want your wallopers spending all their time on these rather trivial matters.
That was a mistake they made in Victoria in particular during lockdown, was to be way too heavy-handed with police enforcing rules like this.
Yeah, they were given, the police were given the opportunity to on occasions be heavy-handed, I would say, but it is an incredibly difficult thing to enforce. I mean, obviously people are visibly not wearing masks and so forth, so it's just a matter of it's not a good use of police time. You've only got limited numbers of these people and they should be concentrating on serious crime.
They could go back to recriminalising burglary of small items, which has been decriminalised in Australia for about 25 years.
Well, we're seeing a lot of these things like, mask fines and things being thrown out now anyway. So, yeah, it really has to come down to making a personal decision. And when you make that decision, and I made that decision a week or so ago, Jack, when I go to the shopping centre and, into indoor areas and so forth, besides pubs and restaurants, of course, there's not much point doing it there. I'll pop a mask on, but I also, when you make that decision, you're also going to make another decision. And I said, I can't do anything about anyone who doesn't want to wear a mask. That's just not my sphere of influence. I have no ability to influence other people. I'm not going to make a personal choice myself.
Well, so we all wear our masks. We had a bit of a couple of gatherings over the weekend for a chap who's one of our number who's leaving to go to Singapore, and we all wear a mask happily to the restaurant on Friday night or to the pub on Saturday night, as the case may be. Pop them in your back pocket when you get there, and stand around and have a few drinks.
Yeah, well, you're not going to be able to drink with them. Well, you could. You could sort of strain your liquids.
You're going to spill even more than normal if you do that.
Yeah, so, look, I think the government's way is the right way, and that is just to sort of, but to allow people to make their own decisions based on good advice. I guess it comes down to that sort of communication again. There are a number of sort of sub-variants that are pretty unpleasant in COVID, and it is putting extraordinary pressure on our public health system. But the best way to do this is not. Well, no one's even talking about lockdowns. There's no call for that.
I think there's no market for that. No political market for lockdowns almost anywhere.
Too many elections going.
Yeah, I think people feel they've done enough in that regard.
Yeah.
And that's not Australia specific. That's the same pretty much around the world.
Yeah, look, we do have those high rates of vaccination. What we don't have is very high rates of boosters, and maybe that's another thing that the government and they have been telling people they've reduced the requirement or the age requirement for boosters, urging people to get their third and fourth. I went down to the doctors and having had COVID about 4 weeks ago, they said you can't get one for 12 weeks. So they're telling you can't become reinfected within 12 weeks, which I don't know stands up statistically. But anyway, there we are.
Like a lot of things, Jack, they've been making this up as we go along because we don't really know.
WA changed it from 12 to 4. So once an infection occurs, you can get a boost after that. I'd also
they'll just close the borders again if they get 3 cases.
Look, if Fremantle keep going poorly, they won't be involved in the finals.
Yeah.
So they might just have to do that. But look, I would also urge our listeners, particularly of a certain vintage, without being cruel about this, go and get a flu shot too. Because there's some particularly unpleasant strain of flu getting around Australia at the moment, particularly around Melbourne. I don't know how you've gone on, Jack, with some of your family, relatives, friends in Melbourne, but anyone who's been hit by that strain of the flu, they'll let you know all about it. Knock you on your ass for a good week. Mm-hmm. All right. Now this is for the Labor faithful, isn't it? Tony Burke has said, told the ABC that we've got the Australian. Let me start again. The Australian Building and Construction Commission, Jack, a sort of rolling body of with Royal Commission type powers overseeing the construction industry, and Labor has basically peeled back its powers with. And it did, in fact, go to the election with a policy of dumping the oversight body altogether. But as of yesterday, as Tony Burke announced, the ABC in its powers will be pulled back to the bare legal minimum, Jack. Now, that is a sign, if we needed one, that the Labor Party is very much still in the thrall of the unions and the construction unions in particular.
This has been something that's been going on for a very long time.
Depends on who's in government.
When did I start in the legal profession? In the mid-'80s, shall we say. And I was working for a law firm that represented the old Builders Labourers Federation back in the days when Norm Gallagher was in fact, we were... I was sort of the very, very junior lawyer helping out on Norm Gallagher's criminal trial for a bit. And
which he ended up having a holiday.
He did get a holiday. I thought he was a bit unfairly treated, to be quite honest, but he did get a holiday.
Yeah. By a federal Labor government, by the way, too.
It was. And they moved to deregister the Builders Labourers Federation. And the BLF were great clients. I think our firm went to the High Court 4 or 5 times in a single year. And I don't think any other client ever has, any other non-government clients ever sent their lawyers to Canberra to argue in the High Court that many times a year. So it's always been it's been a lawyer fest right from those days. So you wouldn't call it bad for society in that regard. But it's a constant battle with the construction industry between keeping the thing working without too much union interference and not being over heavily handed with the unions either. And there will be swings backwards and forwards as time goes on, and no one's ever going to quite get it right.
But the unions are really the only ones who bring health and safety into the construction industry, Jack. And that's another thing that's really overlooked, regardless whether it's the ETU, the CFM, MEU, or whatever body it is. They're the ones actually bringing safety for workers onto building sites.
I wouldn't say that the building unions are all bad by any means.
No.
I was more than happy to act for them.
No, I know you're not, but it is one of those things that's often overlooked. Without the unions coming on site, you can have some very, very dangerous work situations or work environments, be they small, medium, or large construction sites.
And on the other hand, so that's one side of the coin. The other side of the coin is that you can have some very heavy-handed tactics from the unions, which really sort of start to become more of a standover practice than anything else.
And not so much inside the union, but outside it. As with pretty much any construction industry in any Western nation, you have some fairly unpleasant pressures coming from organised crime, essentially. And we're no strangers to that. And indeed, it was one of many disappointments with the Construction Law, the Unions Law Commission, which focused on construction unions to a very large degree, that none of those figures, and many of whom are household names, were asked to give evidence under oath. Some of these guys have been pulling, well, shall we say, they're involved in the business of mediation in the construction industry now, Jack. And none of them got pulled. I've always wondered about that and what the hell was going on there.
Yeah, well, there's never been a short. There's a fair bit of cash and easy money to be made in the construction industry. That's a bit like the racing industry. When you have a business like that or industry like that, you are going to attract some dubious characters.
fairly colourful characters, Jack. Yes, yeah, we are, and that seems to be the case pretty much everywhere around the world. And we aren't no strangers to it.
So I expect they'll wind it back, and then they'll discover. In a couple of years, that they better wind it forward a bit.
Well, they're getting rid of it. Tony Burke says just stripping their powers is a down payment on getting rid of it altogether. They did go to the election with this as policy, by the way. So
and I'm sure they will get rid of it. But you've only got to go back. I can't remember if it was the Gillard or the Rudd government who bought in after having gotten rid of the Howard version. They bought in their own version after a couple more years when things were getting out of hand again.
Yeah, okay. Well, if there ever is going to be a change of government, I suspect the ABCC will be back in some form or another. Anyway, over to media, Jack, and I was looking at the Oz Media Diary today, and word, and I'll quote from it, word has reached Diary that Anthony Albanese will make his first trip as Prime Minister to visit ABC Chair Ita Buttrose at ABC's Ultimo headquarters next week. And the mail out of Canberra is that he'll come bearing gifts for the public broadcaster. Diary can reveal that Albanese will visit Ultimo on Friday week, with the visit including his attendance at a gala ABC 90th birthday dinner at Studio 22. And that'll also involve his involvement on Q&A. We're told the PM will use a visit and a keynote address at the dinner to formally announce that the government will protect the ABC and provide funding certainty, largely by moving from a 3-year to a 5-year funding cycle for the public broadcaster. And on it goes, Jack. Is this a case of the ABC needing support, funding support, needing moral support from the government after a long absence?
Well, I found this all quite amusing. He also, the spokesperson for the Prime Minister, also said that they were doing all this to safeguard the ABC against political interference. And I was just wondering, when was the last time there was any political interference of the ABC rather than by the ABC?
Well, there may be a little bit, but there were the complaints from ministers.
But complaints from ministers are just robust exchanges of views between the politicians and the media.
It's always just politicians saying we don't like what we've seen.
And if we're going to talk about that, let's go back to the two of the champions of the robust exchange of views between politicians and the media are on our side, on the Labor side of politics. Paul Keating was a master of the late-night telephone call, and there was always plenty of expletives involved, but at least he was reasonably coherent but the other fellow who's the world champion at it was Prime Minister Rudd, who was notorious for ripping shreds off, and screaming down the phone at editors from
more generally, I think not so much to the ABC, where there was a bit of love, maybe, arguably anyway, but in commercial media, News Corp
in particular,
get on the blower there and give it a blast. But also in the Turnbull government, there were, I would say, fairly strong attempts to influence the ABC there. we would obviously say that the ABC doesn't get things right all the time, and we might say that they don't get things right often enough nowadays. Is funding going to create better news, a better approach to their news broadcasting?
Well, it depends what they spend it on. If they piss it all up against the wall on a 24-hour news service, then the answer to that's no.
No, I would say that you could trace their drop off in news reporting pretty much to the establishment of the ABC 24-hour news service, which is really about only, as I said before, it's only about 18 because they buy in Al Jazeera and BBC overnight.
What's actually missing from the ABC
in the news department
in the news department particularly, are some crusty old editors who'll say, "Listen, you've got to work a bit more on this story before it goes to air."
I think there have been those decisions made. I know they have. I know there have been in some of the Four Corners programs. What it doesn't want to be is really it doesn't want to be a sort of tabloid shouty program or their current affairs, whether it be at 7:30 or Four Corners. Don't want to be sort of shouty tabloid magazine style programs, nor do they want to be incredibly boring and dull. So they need to find that measure, and I think that you're absolutely right. Need a few hard old news guys to say, you haven't got this story quite right yet. You need to do A, B, and C before we can run it. And I think that's something that they're missing at the moment. Having had a little bit of experience.
This is not about a political It's not about a political approach. This is just traditional, old-fashioned news reporting where, your editor said, well, that's all very well, but what about X and what about Y and what about Z? You haven't covered that at all.
Yeah, I'd say that. I mean, I've sort of given the game away there. I tend to watch SBS News from 6:30 to 7:30 in the evening news bulletins there. That's the one that I'll watch. I prefer getting a larger chunk of world news that the SBS delivers, but also find their domestic reporting pretty good as well. So I've kind of dropped off the ABC. We'll have a glance at 7:30 most nights, but it'll be a glance if some of the stories don't really leap off the page to me, Jack.
The other thing they could use is just a little bit more diversity of views, because they do get a bit boring.
Well, with any
there's a certain sameness about it.
Look, I think they sort of bend over backwards to a large degree to do that, but it is, the ABC is always trying to find its identity, whether it is broadcasting to our inner suburbs and progressive left people, or is it going out to our rural people? Is it going out to the regions? I think it always has this identity crisis about all of that. What I'm really talking about is them just sharpening up their news reporting and their current affairs reporting.
Yeah, well, I couldn't agree more about that. One thing I noticed was that they're going to spend $8 million on sending TV into the Pacific Islands, which I think is an excellent idea. But Scott Morrison actually, strangely enough, got something right. He said he didn't think sending Q&A to Honiara would have improved the Solomon Islands problem much, and on that one I agree with him. Q&A is just about the most boring thing on television.
Yeah, it's not good. It used to be sort of must-watch TV for a brief period about 15 years ago. Yes, well, John, we didn't actually talk about Scott Morrison, Jack. He reckons government, was deeply flawed. Not the sort of thing. He's a man of God. He's waiting for God to speak to him, but he's not pro-government, Jack. He said this in a speech to Margaret at the Margaret Court Group in Perth a couple of weeks ago. And you think, mate, you were in government. You were leading a government. You've got to have some faith in it.
Yeah, no, I think you can lead a government and have a belief that there's a lot that government tries to do today that it shouldn't. I think that's a quite legitimate point of view. At any event, he's going to become the most ex of ex-prime ministers.
Oh, yeah. She's certainly with views like that. I mean, he wasn't just saying, government should have a light touch. He was saying government's untrustworthy and unreliable. Yeah. All right.
Now, just one thing I wanted to raise.
Yes.
I opened the newspaper this morning, well, at least in a digital sense, and once more there were more photos of how terrible things are in the airports and airlines in Australia, and how slow the service is, and the queues outside getting into the airports. And all the comments were indicating this is all Alan Joyce's fault. This is Macquarie Bank's fault because they own the Sydney airport. And I'd just like to point out to
our listeners, the roads to get to the Sydney airport too, Jack.
Yeah, just like to point out to our listeners that if you open the newspapers in the UK and Ireland, anywhere in Europe or anywhere in the US or Canada, you're going to find exactly the same story. This is a worldwide phenomenon. It's being caused because all of these organisations laid off staff during COVID, and now they can't get them back.
I think the data that I looked at, so 1 in 5 flights were being cancelled.
That's much the same with Heathrow or
Gatwick, I'm sure it is,
or Schiphol or anywhere you go.
It's got to be very frustrating for travellers, and it sort of works on my theory that people are at their actual worst at an airport. Personal behaviour.
Can I just put in a plug for Hong Kong? The one place that there are no queues at the airport, and there's no long lines queuing up outside in the hot sun, and that's in Hong Kong because we have bugger all flights.
Not a lot of flights coming in, and when you do come in, you're frog marched off for a 7-day spell in a hotel somewhere.
That's right. So if you want to solve that problem in Australia, just go to a 7-day quarantine. Interstate travel and all,
Yeah, look, I'm heading down to Melbourne, Jack, and doing it next month, and doing it with the with some concern that I might be. I don't like spending time at airports, so I like to get there just about the time you're supposed to board and jump on and jump off and get out as soon as possible. But
there was a time when people liked to go to the airport in Melbourne, Jack.
When I was a kid, it was an excursion. Great place to go.
Well, I think I'm not sure you were old enough to participate in this, but there was a time when the old Essendon Airport was a very popular place on a Sunday, and that's because
had a license.
It had a license to have a cold beer on a Sunday. It was the only place in the town that you could legally get a cold drink on a Sunday. So people used to pop out there just for that, but. They've never been great places to go.
My only memory of Essendon, I must have flown through there, but my only memory of Essendon Airport was being out there for LBJ's arrival, Jack.
Oh, were you waving a little flag?
Yeah, my mother dragged my brother and I out there to stand amongst the throng and go all the way with LBJ.
Excellent.
I
wish there was a photo.
My father, this won't surprise you. My father did not attend, and was very dirty on the fact that that my mother was taking us out.
Yeah, that's why I'm still sitting here rather shocked that you were there. I can't imagine Uncle Jack being too keen on that plan.
Sat in the chair and didn't speak to his wife for a number of days. Yeah. In sport, Jack. There goes Billy, Valet Billy Picken, the great Collingwood centre-half back, whose catch cry was as he'd come to a marking contest, "Here comes Billy."
Yeah.
Very
he was
sad,
wonderfully eccentric, wasn't he?
He was. He was just one of those blokes who would never shut up during a game. He used to drive Mark McClure, man, and I know I've heard McClure speak about that. They used to have some very famous duels, those two.
Had some cracking duels, those two.
Yeah, and probably you'd call it all even in the end. Maybe a touch to hit McClure, just a touch ahead because they won a few more premierships. But he played 207 games for the Magpies between 1974 and 1983. He did play briefly at Sydney. I don't know if you remember that.
Did a season there, I think. Didn't he play a few
Yeah,
games?
might have been a couple of seasons there, I think. But he was well and truly at the end of his football career there. High flyer, great mark, great defensive.
Great mark, terrible kick.
Wasn't it? Wasn't his top of the resume skill, but he.
But it was a different world in those days because they weren't playing possession footy, keepings off footy. So you could just thump it down the field, and the other blokes had to
Another marking contest.
Yeah, other blokes had to earn their own footy. He would need to improve his kicking skills to get a game today, but he was a fantastic mark.
Brilliant mark. And his son, of course, was a premiership footballer at the Western Bulldogs, and he was a really tough, hard footballer too. In fact, he had to give it away because his body gave way. He's just been throwing it in, getting belted.
I never met Billy, but I had a few pals who knew him because he liked to punt, liked the races. I think and they all said he was a terrific bloke, and no reason to doubt that at all.
Yeah. And just to add to Collingwood's grief, the club's grief, Colin Britt, who played 110 games, half-back flanker, winger, wasn't he, Jack?
He was on the half-back flank, I think, in the 1970 grand final, which you'll probably enjoy remembering, but the Collingwood fans won't.
No, he didn't. I actually I remember seeing him play, and John Nichols had to get involved there with Con, who was he was probably giving Big Nick a couple of stone. And I think Con Britt copped a whack across the chops for his trouble.
Oh, look, I think there's fighting out of your weight division, and then there's fighting out of your weight division. You wouldn't be taking on Big Nick.
Well, Crackers Keenan always talked about that moment when you looked into those baby blue eyes and you knew you were in trouble.
Yeah.
So Collingwood did have the black armbands on Sunday up against your mob, Jack. I watched the game. Oh, God. Collingwood did it again. They've come from nowhere and won. But the last minute where Essendon kicked the point and the ball came in, well, it wasn't even a minute. It was probably 30 seconds where Essendon just did not set up a defensive zone. The ball went from a short pass from kick out to a bloke who could run. And within another possession, the ball was in the hands of Elliott,
Jamie Elliott. Lovely kick after the siren.
Yeah, it was a lovely kick after the siren, but he outmarked two blokes who made no body contact with him. It was the sort of thing a battling side, the sort of mistake a battling side would make. Collingwood got the points.
Yeah. They're going okay, the boys.
Well, they're fourth at the moment, 9 in a row, and that doesn't. I was on the Bombers. I was so invested because Carlton would have moved up a spot, and Collingwood would have moved down 3 had they lost that game. Because their percentage is not great, obviously, because they're only winning games by a couple of points. But yes, it was just a mistake on Essendon's part. They didn't set up the zone, and then they did have one back, did have an extra bloke back, but neither he or his teammate made an impact in that marking contest. They had to put some body pressure on.
These days teams practice for these scenarios. They actually workshop these scenarios. So they're worse errors than they used to be. But yeah. Anyway, look, it's all panning out.
It's all part of football's rich festivities, Jack. Always good to see Collingwood.
I felt sorry for the Richmond. Was it the Richmond kiddie on the earlier in the weekend who took the mark and unaware that the siren was about to go?
Well, he knew he wouldn't have got the distance. I think that was kind of, he would have been devastated. But Richmond certainly blew that one as well, which leaves us with, and that puts them just out of the 8 now. They're 9th. and it is a bit of blockage in that, certainly in the bottom half of the 8. Now, Jack, we go from the top: Geelong, Melbourne, Brisbane, Fremantle. Collingwood, then Fremantle, then Sydney, then Carlton, and Western Bulldogs have pushed themselves into the 8 this weekend. Is that the way it's going to be? Do you reckon?
Well, it's hard to know. I mean, if you're starting the
4
finals,
games left.
if you're starting the finals tomorrow, you'd say Geelong would be pretty red hot favourites because they're in slashingly good form. And who else is in good form? Brisbane are coming good a little bit. Swans are in great form.
They are.
And probably of the ones just outside the 8, probably Richmond are probably still look the best. I think maybe Richmond or the Bulldogs. But it's kind of hard to know. It's 4 weeks away.
Yeah, look, it's a month of footy before we're going to know. They don't hand out premierships in July, Jack. That's one thing.
No, they don't.
You can say, and if you're in blinding form now, there's always that question you might not be in blinding form in.
But Geelong are going very, very nicely.
Oh, they are the best contested footy side going around at the moment. No doubt about that. They're very, very good at the contest. Over to the NRL, Jack, and there's some new faces. Well, some faces from the old Storm are now 5th, and they've beaten the 1-2 for pretty much the last 10 years. We've got the Sharks at 3, the Panthers who are dominating the competition.
Well, it's Panthers and the rest, really, isn't it? You know,
and the Broncos haven't played finals for years. They're at 4th. Rabbitohs sort of hanging around there, and the Eels and the Roosters are starting to play some good footy. So that's got a lot of promise to it, doesn't it? You know, that final series.
Look, there's three teams outside the 8 who, you know...
thereabouts,
who are thereabouts, but the bookmakers don't seem to agree, you know. The Raiders and the Dragons are on equal points with 8th place Roosters, but they're $100 to 100 to 1 to win the premiership. So the punters, at least, have ruled them out pretty much.
Yeah, the Roosters, you know, probably on paper better sides than the next 3, and that's Sea Eagles, Raiders, and Dragons. And the Panthers look like the standout, but the Storm have really dropped off. They tend to a little bit in and around state of origin, but the Panthers have provided more players to both Queensland and New South Wales, and they seem to be going on their merry way. And they are even money to win the flag with the next on the betting line, the Cowboys at basically paying $7.50, 15 to 2, and then you've got the Storm still sort of hanging around there with favouritism, but they look like dropping into the bottom half of the 8th.
Yeah. I saw Craig Bellamy not looking his usual equable self post match at the weekend.
You'd love to play him in a game of poker, wouldn't you? Because he really does give a fair bit away. The other bloke, the Raiders coach, I'd love to play him. The former Australian and New South Wales.
Ricky Stewart.
Ricky, I'd love to play him in a game of poker, mate, because he leaves all the emotions out there. He just lets you know. And he'll often spend half a press conference just complaining about the refereeing.
Yeah, he does.
Which I love.
He's always got plenty to say. I remember... years ago, when I was still in Sydney, a mate was in something called the Freddie Fittler box. He had tickets in this Freddie Fittler box. So Freddie would host this box for the Roosters. So you go up to the private box up at the football stadium, the now demolished football stadium, and there'd be beers and food and all that sort of stuff. And Freddie would take a few people down to the rooms before the Roosters games. Ricky was coaching the Roosters at this stage. And Ricky would come back up. Freddie would come back up with the people he'd taken down there, and Freddie would explain to the rest of us what Ricky's plans were for the game. So Freddie would go through a few of the more simple things that Ricky had played. Then there was all this more complicated stuff that I couldn't understand, and none of the players could. Which was kind of Ricky in a nutshell, really.
Well, my favourite Ricky Stewart story, Jack. He was coaching the Roosters at the time, and I had popped down with a mate at the Lord Dudley Hotel in Paddington on a Friday afternoon for some refreshment. And, it was knock-off time, around about 4 or 5 anyway. And there was Ricky with his coaching, and I think from memory coaching the following day. And there he was with his manager, and who I knew, and we had a bit of a chat. And I noticed Ricky was absolutely blind drunk. He couldn't speak. Couldn't speak.
Good preparation. Yeah.
Good prep, put in the hard yards there. Thank God the players didn't do it, although sometimes they do in the NRL, Jack. Mate, great to have you with me again today. I think we haven't solved a lot of the problems, but we have identified them, and we've gone through them with some excellent analysis provided by you. Well done, mate.
Cheers, mate.
All right, mate. And once again, we remind our listeners, just if you want to get in touch with the program, with Jack and myself, drop us a line at the conditional release program at gmail.com, or hit me up on Twitter. DMs are open. And thank you.
Especially if you're going to have a crack at me.
Yeah, well, Collingwood supporters can come and have a crack at me. I've been dealing with those people for 60 years. And I have no fear of them. But look, yes, we do appreciate any sort of correspondence that we do receive. So flick us a line if you want us to talk about something that we haven't mentioned in the program, some issue. We did sort of education on that basis last week. Yeah, just drop us a line. You know how to do that. Good on you, Jack. Talk to you next week.
Cheers, mate.
See you, listeners.